Hello, everybody, and welcome to those of you who are joining the live stream. Thank you all for logging on this morning. In a second, I'll hand over to Nick Waters, who will talk about open source investigation and its conceptual underpinnings, the work of bellingcat's investigation team, and be sharing some practical kind of information about how to use some of these tools. The conversation is taking part as a series of exchanges. We, a group of artist researchers studying at Goldsmiths University, have organised with the support of our bike gallery. Through our residency, we have been asked to critically consider the overarching theme of systems in the broadest sense, encompassing the social, economic, technological and political implications of emergent and embedded networks and systems. We are currently 3 weeks into a process-led online residency at our bike via a platform we established online at ingrid.io. I've pasted a link to the website on the Twitch chat, and everybody in the Zoom should already have it, hopefully. So far, we have had the pleasure to speak with Artist Collective Kaiken, artist researcher Tiga Brain, and we have lots more up our sleeves in the coming weeks, alongside our own research, workshops, and artworks. All of these sessions and materials are accessible to watch back or to download on ingrid.io. And I think that's about it. So I'm going to hand over to you, Nick, after which, throughout which we'll have time for some questions, and we'll have a short Q&A session at the end as well. So if you are watching the stream, if you want to type any questions in the Twitch, I can feed those into the discussion. Okay, thank you.
Cool. Hi everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you guys. I've spoken at Goldsmiths quite a bit before. I've worked quite closely with forensic architecture and Airwalls too. So it's pretty cool to be here and chat to you guys. So what I'm going to go through, let me introduce myself first. So my name is Nick Waters. I am a senior investigator for bellingcat. I've been writing for them since 2016 and working for them full-time since 2018, when we actually got enough budget to actually pay people, which was good. Previously, before bellingcat, I was in the army for 4 years as an infantry officer, then came out, did a master's at King's College London in conflict security and development. I then did cyber threat intelligence for a couple of years while I was writing for bellingcat as well, and now I'm working for bellingcat full-time. And primarily my work at bellingcat is focused on conflict and civilian harm in conflict. So I've been quite deeply involved in looking at chemical weapons attack in Syria, airstrikes in Syria, as well as airstrikes in Yemen as well. But then I also do some other random topics, such as the use of small drones by sub-state actors like the Islamic State. And then recently I've been tracking the use of police violence in the US, primarily against journalists. So I've kind of got experience in all different places. And if anyone wants to ask any questions about it, please feel free. In terms of bellingcat, for those who aren't that familiar with bellingcat, basically it's now a Dutch charity is in fact what we are now. So we switched over from being a collective of journalists to actually a Dutch charity quite recently. And it's comprised of a lot of journalists, analysts, investigators, lots of different backgrounds who use open source to investigate topics. And to give you an idea of the kind of mentality of bellingcat, you really just have to look at the name. So some of you might be familiar with Aesop's fables, the parable of the tortoise and the hare, that kind of thing. And one of Aesop's fables was a story about some mice in a house. And these mice were, just going around their business. They were, eating the crumbs from the floor that fell from the man's table. And, the man was like, I don't really like these mice. I'm going to get a cat. And so the cat started hunting down, catching, killing, and eating these mice. And so these mice held a meeting and said to each other, what are we going to do about this cat? It's killing us. And a young, bold mouse stood up and said, I know what we're going to do. We're going to put a bell around the neck of the cat. And then, like, everybody laughed and jumped for joy because they thought they solved the problem. And then an older mouse stood up, banged on the table, and said, but who's going to put that bell around the neck of the cat? Is it going to be you? And pointed at the young mouse, and they're all silent. And the idea is you can propose any solution you want, but you have to actually carry it through. And that's where the name bellingcat comes from. Bellingcat, belling the cat. We are the ones who put the bell around the neck of the cat, hence the name, which might give you an idea of what the kind of mentality that we have. So along with that mentality and that name, we use primarily what is described as open source information in order to carry out our investigations. And this could be stuff like satellite imagery, whether commercial or stuff you can get on, like, say, Google Maps. We also use traditional source of news as well, like BBC, CNN, and so on, as well as local news outlets. Social media, we use a huge amount: YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, Vika Conte, local social media accounts, forums, and also more kind of traditional databases, your LexisNexis, Companies House, etc. The kind of place where you can find lots of data that you can query if you want. But we also deal with slightly less clearly open sources sometimes. So we will work with hacks, leaks, and dumps. So that is information that has been obtained almost certainly illegally. However, it has already been posted online. So we are not the people who do these hacks. However, hackers will often post the information that they get online, and we will use that information. Phone books like Truecaller or Get Contact, and the idea is that, you know, they can tell you who phoned you, you know, what telephone number phoned you, but they can also be quite useful to use if you query them. You can find out whose names associated with certain telephone numbers. Use like exposed SQL or Amazon Web Services and Google Drives as well, which you might work out how to find after the practical part of this presentation. And then also your dark web stuff. Although actually we touched this a lot less than I think people would assume. Say a Dream Market, Silk Rose, other dark web sites. But honestly, we don't actually use those that much. In terms of our definition of an open source, it's anything that is freely available, as in, like, anyone can go online and find that material, even if you have to pay for it. You don't have to have a special, you don't need to be part of a special group of people. You don't have to have any special clearance in order to find this information. Anyone can obtain it, even if you have to pay a little bit of money for it. So that's our definition of open source. You might see that definition change a bit. That's the one we use. And we don't regard what we do as hacking. We don't enter credentials or stolen credentials at all. So we don't hack. It's not stealing, because this stuff is all publicly indexed. And we don't regard it as spying either, because it's all public information. So this kind of, or the kind of techniques I'm going to show you, really kind of started being used by the general public in the very early 2010s. And it started off really with people, as all the best things do, with people arguing on the internet. So you had lots of people following the conflict in Libya, and they were trying to work out where the front lines were. And in order to do that, you would look at videos which are being filmed by the fighters. Because, you know, if they took a town, they'd film themselves walking through a town or take a picture of that town. And so you try to verify that video or that image in order to, you know, work out where the front lines were. 10 years later, we've moved on from people arguing on the Something Awful forums into something like respectability. So we've seen this kind of open source expertise being used by the New York Times and their visual investigation team, which just a few weeks ago won a Pulitzer Prize for their incredibly impressive investigations. By the BBC, Anatomy of a Killing, They've got a small open source cell which generally works with BBC Africa Eye, does some fantastic work. You've got Human Rights Watch, who recently advertised for an open source head. And you've got the United Nations looking for this kind of expertise as well. So in the kind of 10 years from people like vehemently arguing online and having flame wars about who had taken or which faction had taken which town in Libya, you now have the same kind of skills, often the same people actually being employed by serious journalist organizations, by accountability bodies and so on, which is quite cool, I think. And we've seen this, these kind of skills being applied to lots of stuff. Although initially in the kind of public sphere, these skills were applied to conflict or to tracking conflict. There have been people who've applied them very, very effectively to environmental research, to corruption and financial research. So, for example, Scottish Limited Partnerships in the UK were identified as a result of tracking through Companies House, criminal research and historical research. And you'll see examples from most of these throughout the presentation. Are there any kind of questions about what open source is, what bellingcat is, or who I am at all? No. Cool. All right, in that case, I'll crack on into the kind of conceptual underpinning of what we do, as well as some case studies. Okay, so talking about the use of social media for monitoring. Basically, social media has become almost an ephemeral history of humanity, which is sounds kind of glib, but there are serious academic papers on it. Basically, people post about pretty much everything: current events, their culture, bizarre subcultures, and so it represents this vast body of information which you can draw little bits out if you like. And this is really interesting because it ties into a almost utopian concept that was dreamt up in the 1950s, which is the idea of societal verification of arms control. And basically, the idea was that, in the 1950s, quite a lot of people wanted to prevent the proliferation of nuclear arms because, definitely only Russia, the USA, and the UK could be trusted with them. So they decided to try and prevent the proliferation of them. And the idea was thought up called inspection by the people. And the idea was that populations of countries, it was in everyone's interest to prevent the proliferation or the further proliferation of nuclear weapons. And so the idea was populations in a country were the best place to prevent this happening. And because, nobody wanted to die in a fiery thermonuclear fireball, everybody would want to participate in this kind of action. So the idea was, if someone thought that nuclear arms were being proliferated, down the road or something, they'd be able to phone up the United Nations and say, hey, I think, the Netherlands, my country, is building a nuclear bunker in The Hague. Can you come down and tell them to stop, please? So slightly improved, obviously became very difficult to do because people don't generally work like that. In the 1960s, this was vastly improved by the idea of giving a $1 million reward to anyone who identified this kind of proliferation. But it kind of languished for a bit because with phone lines, it's actually quite difficult, especially with populations, it's quite difficult to encourage them to actively forward that kind of information to authoritative bodies like the UN. But in the 1990s, there was renewed interest in the theory with proliferation of the internet. And then in the 2010s, suddenly everyone is doing it entirely by accident. Everyone's got a camera phone, which is almost entirely network connected. People are taking pictures, posting it online. Effectively, what we've seen is a creation of the most powerful information network, intelligence network, information network that's ever been created, and anyone can access it, which is mind-blowing. And people use it to post pictures of cats and stuff. Hey. So in terms of using social media for monitoring, everybody likes posting interesting stuff or filming interesting stuff. And we have seen people risk their lives to try and get this kind of content. In terrorist attacks, in airstrikes, chemical weapons attacks, some people will pull out their phone and they will start recording, taking pictures, filming. And this isn't just a voyeuristic impulse. There is a need for a lot of people to bear witness to what is happening. Whether that is standing around and watching, or now today pulling out their phone and filming, a police officer kneeling on the neck of a man for, like 10 minutes. This desire to bear witness to events that are happening around them is an incredibly powerful phenomenon. Now that we have phones, we can do that and spread that information faster than we ever had before. And as I said, people will risk their lives for this. So in 2017, there was a partially detonated, or an IED on the Underground train in London that partially detonated. So what happened, the contents of the IED burned rather than exploded, so it created a fireball. Hundreds of people were injured. And the tube train pulled up at a station, opened its doors, and ran off. So bearing in mind, people would have been, some people would have been badly burnt, had their hair on fire and so on. It would have not been possible to see this and not realize that something bad had happened. So bearing that in mind, how soon after that event took place do you think this picture of the IED was taken, and why? Go for it. Just unmute yourself and shout out.
Very soon. Almost immediately.
And why is that?
Because it looks like it's smouldering.
Yeah, precisely. So yeah, within a minute, or maybe a minute or so, a few seconds, a couple of minutes, but very, very soon after, it's still on fire. So what happened was someone was either on this train or on the station. In either case, would have seen lots of injured people, lots of panic, would have gone up to this object, seen it was on fire despite clearly being connected to whatever just happened, taken out their phone and gone, "Oh, look, a bomb!" and taken a picture, and then posted that on social media. People will literally risk their lives to get this kind of content and to bear witness. Which creates it's an incredibly powerful phenomenon. Because social media is designed to be addictive, you get that little hit of endorphin when you get that like, that retweet, you get that extra share. The systems in which people are interacting with are encouraging you to post this kind of content as well. And because humans are naturally gregarious, we want to share this kind of information not only with our personal networks, but frequently with our wider networks as well. So not just our friends and family, but anyone who will listen. And the results is vast amounts of data, whether that's pictures of fancy food, cats playing pianos, or current events as well. And you can track these kind of current events and these events simply by looking at the metadata about social media posts, about the data about these social media posts. So for example, in Demos is a think tank in London. They have a section called the Centre for the Analysis of Social Media. They came up with the idea of what's called a twitcident. And basically, the idea of a twitcident is that if you look at keywords related to a specific event, let's take a train crash, for example, beg your pardon, then when the train crash does occur, you'll see an exponential rise in the number of social media posts or tweets mentioning those keywords. So for example, if we think about keywords related to a train crash, we're thinking train, rails, derailed, hurt, crash, those kind of keywords. So what you'd see is you monitor these keywords, and the number of social media posts using these keywords is a kind of natural progression over 24 hours as people wake up, treat about random stuff, and then go to sleep again. But then if a train crash does happen, what you will see is a vast or exponentially larger number of people using these kind of keywords. And this is called a twitcident. And a twitcident is really interesting for a few different reasons. Firstly, you can actually work out when an event happened really surprisingly quickly. Even in Yemen in 2015, where internet penetration is still very limited, and smartphone, thinking back in 2015, smartphone proliferation is quite limited too. You're still seeing people posting about airstrikes as they are happening, within literally a few minutes, like 4 or 5 minutes after an airstrike has taken place. And if you can get back to that very earliest social media post, you can actually find out with a surprising degree of accuracy when an event took place. And after the first large media report, you'll tend to find the number of tweets increases even more exponentially, as people outside the immediate network of those associated with the incident or the event become aware of the event having taken place and start posting about it. And the kind of content we try and find is in between the two. It's that kind of the social media posts of people who are associated with that event or incident. And within that kind of content, you're much more likely to find genuine images or videos. After the first media report, you'll tend to find people repost images or videos that are completely unconnected to the incident or the event. They just want, it's that addiction in action. They want those retweets, those likes. Maybe they have an agenda, maybe they don't, but you're much more likely to find not genuine videos or images after the first mainstream media report. And just to show you that this is not something that happens in my head, that does actually happen. In 2015, in March, there was an airstrike in Mastaba in Yemen. And these are mentions of Mastaba over time on Twitter. And you can see a very clear example of a Twitter incident there mentioning Mastaba, or something had happened in Mastaba, which was an airstrike. Again, this is an example from Yemen. So this isn't just something that is conceptual and happens in my head. This happens every day. And this is all there on social media, on Facebook, on Twitter. You can access it if you manage to get a Twitter API account, or if you know how to use Twint. But yeah, the kind of content that I was talking about in that window between it first happening and it going viral is the kind of content that we aim to identify, and then verify, and then amplify. And then for the kind of next part of this presentation, I'll be talking about the verification aspect and how we take this kind of content and say, hey, this happened, or it's partially verified, or this didn't happen. So any questions about the kind of conceptual basis about what we do and how we do it, or what we do really? Oh, blasted you guys all with information. All right, cool. Okay, so a key part of the verification aspect is geolocation. So placing an incident in space. And the idea is, if you can place a piece of content in space and time, then effectively you verified it, because you know exactly where it happened and when it happened. And geolocation is a key part of that. So, for example, let's take the Caesar photographs. So the Caesar photographs were a set of photographs, tens of thousands of photographs taken by a Syrian defector, codenamed Syria. His real name has never been released. And he was he worked at a military hospital. I believe he was a police photographer. His job was to take pictures of the bodies who had died either in custody or after custody, which were then transferred through the hospital. So he had taken pictures of hundreds, thousands of people who showed clear signs of torture and execution, very clear signs of torture and execution. Now, when some of these images were released to say, hey, look, this is real, there were the kind of pretty standard reactions you'd expect from some people saying, these images are faked. They were taken in a completely different place. These weren't taken in Damascus. These were taken in the UAE, whatever. So if we examine that, we can show it's not true, because we're able to place the photos precisely in space. So this is an example of one of the photos. The bodies are out of shot below because the photo's been rotated. But this just shows the background. And just by using this background, we can work out almost exactly where this image was taken. So very difficult to see because this it's a digital image that's degraded somewhat. But right at the back, you can see what appear to be two masts on top of the hill, two structures on top of the hill. And I want you just to bear that in mind as we switch into Google Earth and then zoom down into the military hospital where Caesar said he worked. So this is the parking area of where Caesar said he worked. And when we go down into that parking area and turn on Google Landscape View, and then the infrastructure view, bearing in mind this Google Earth. Anyone can download it for free. You can see 2 antennae on top of the hill, which seems to match what we were seeing in that Caesar photograph. And what's more, the landscape seems to fit pretty much perfectly as well. So you have the hill in the background, a slightly lower hill, more in the foreground. But for us, this is nowhere near good enough to say this image happened here. We want to be a lot more certain. So when we carry out these kind of geolocations, we look at multiple different key features in order to match the image or video we're trying to geolocate with reference imagery such as satellite imagery. So in the top left, you have satellite imagery of this location, and the bottom right, you have Caesar's photo. And you can see we've got wide open space with 2 buildings either side, which appear to match what we're seeing on satellite imagery here. We have a small building to the back left of that open space. We've got another smaller building, kind of more central to the open space. Up on the hill to the left, you can see what appear to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 buildings or shipping containers, which you can actually count and see the same number here. You can see just peeking through the trees on the back right, another building. And then because this satellite image was taken around the same time that Caesar took his picture, you can actually see the 2 buses lined up in the vehicle park as well. And because Caesar took this picture pretty much aligned perfectly with this truck, we can see that he would have been standing, if we draw a line through his truck, we can see that he was standing pretty much exactly there when he took this photo. So by looking at details within the image, we can work out almost precisely where this person was standing when they took the picture. And this is the kind of verification that we'll carry out when we look at this kind of content. And sometimes when we're carrying out this verification process, in fact, almost always, we'll find a further story behind it. And in this case, it was the fact that this parking area is right next to the presidential palace in Damascus, where Mr. Assad lives. In fact, it's just over 500 meters away. So when Mr. Assad claims that torture isn't happening in Syria, it's happening less than a kilometer, just over 500 meters away from his presidential palace. So might indicate how much you actually trust him. Now, that is a individual example of a geolocation. But you can really step it up if you want to and start to squeeze as much information as possible out of an image or video as you can. And what I'm about to show you is an example of that. So in 2017, the International Criminal Court issued a arrest warrant for a Libyan warlord called Wafali, who was fighting in Benghazi. And what's interesting about this arrest warrant is that it was based entirely on open source evidence. In this case, it was videos posted to Facebook by one of Wafali's associates, which showed executions taking place, or him participating in the execution of scores of people that he accused of being members of the Islamic State. So we took one of those videos, or found one of those videos, and decided to see, what information could we squeeze out of this just looking at the video. When did it happen? Where did it happen? How it happened? And so what I'm about to show you is a result of that investigation. Just heads up, this does show the kind of aftermath of the execution as stills. It is not particularly gory. It does show some blood, which is a key part of the investigation, just to let you know that it is there. Okay, so we had this video. And the thing about watching a video is that you'll only see a single frame actually at a time. And we want to maximize the amount of information we can see in one time. So what we can do is extract stills from this video and then stitch them together to create a panorama. And by doing that, we can see much more information about the area in one place than if we just watch the video over and over again. So in this panorama, we noticed a few interesting things that could be key features. So firstly, we had a fork in the road. Well, no, firstly, we had buildings, I beg your pardon, which were quite distinctive. We had a wall in the back right, and we had a fork in the road. These buildings are quite distinctive. If you notice at the base, they've got a large or wide open gap. And we found an area in Benghazi which had very similar kind of structures with a large open gap at the base. It's called the Chinese Housing Project, the Chinese Building Project in Benghazi. The problem with this is that the Chinese Housing Project was actually pretty massive, down to South Benghazi. So what we did is we spent, it's back in 2017, we'll probably do it faster now, we spent multiple hours, a couple of weeks, I think, with 3 people, searching for the potential location where this incident had taken place. So, you know, we're looking for somewhere the fork in the road, buildings in the background, and then a wall as well. And we potentially, or we thought we had identified a potential match, which is located here. So we had a fork in the road, we had buildings in the background which appeared to fit, and we had a wall on the right-hand side. But we wanted to be really certain of this. So we were looking for other details to try and confirm it. And what we did is we looked at satellite imagery, and we matched up the bushes that you can see in the video of the execution with that satellite imagery. So the bushes that you can see in the top half of the video match perfectly with satellite imagery. And this was confirmed beyond any kind of doubt when new satellite imagery became available, and we saw these spots appear as location. And it took us a while to work out precisely what these spots were until we compared it with the video, and it became evident that these spots were the blood stains from the people who've been executed. So the new location was spot on. The bloodstains matched up with where these people were killed, almost precisely. So next we need to establish date and time. So we knew the rough date because they're posted on the video, which made it slightly easier for us. And we could use people as a sundial, look at their shadow to work out the time. And we could confirm the dates using that satellite imagery because we knew it happened between the 14th and the 17th of July. So we had the precise location, the time, which is about 6:30 in the morning, and the date range, which was from the 15th to 17th, which is consistent with when they claimed to have carried out the killing, which was in the morning of the 17th, I believe. And that was just by taking a single video and squeezing as much information as possible from that video. So before I get on to the next topic, which is leaks database and digital shadows, are there any questions about social media, the kind of information that's posted on social media? Yeah.
Well, I was just wondering about that investigation in particular, when you were saying that you were narrowing down kind of the location over a course of weeks. I was wondering what that sort of process was like, and also why you thought it might be quicker now than it was in 2017.
Yeah. So we basically carried out what we call brute forcing. So usually what we'll do is we'll use like contextual clues to narrow down the area as much as possible. So like front lines where someone says they live, like the neighborhood, you know, buildings in the background. Sometimes it's not possible to narrow it down much further than, say, like a general area. And in this case, that was true. So it was only the Chinese Housing Project. We then basically just checked everywhere. I think we start off by looking at every track which had a fork in it. And then we identified all the different areas or different tracks with forks in them, and then checked them to see if there was a wall and buildings there. As you can imagine, in that kind of area, there were lots and lots and lots of examples of those. So the case of visiting each one and then physically checking it, or manually checking it. And we weren't sure about the geolocation until we checked the bushes. I think it'd be faster now because I think we've just done this more. Yeah, I think we have systems in place to better indicate where we've checked. I think we're more skilled in terms of this kind of geolocation. So yeah, it's primarily about personal skill and the kind of processes that we'd use for this kind of geolocation, really.
Okay, great, thanks.
I got a question about how you know, you're really focused on things that are occurring in Syria and Yemen, and I was just wondering how do you go about investigating these places when, of course, a lot of the records of videos or things are in like Arabic? Are you are you able to understand it, or how do you kind of like go about kind of like making sure that you're investigating something properly? Because I think that's something that I would struggle with, at least. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a really good question. We get onto a little bit in the practical aspect, but I'll answer the question now because it's useful to explain. So what we're looking at in a lot of these kind of instances is pretty significant events. These are very macro factors, like a bomb being dropped from a plane and then exploding in a conflict where one side has an air force and one side doesn't. So it's pretty major events. In terms of the kind of information that we look for, actually Google Translate is actually really good, primarily for translating stuff like location names. We'll also have like location name database and stuff that we use too, especially for places like Afghanistan, where this kind of work is really difficult because spelling varies a lot. But Google Translate actually does cover most of what you need and getting the gist of social media posts. I would never use Google Translate to, for example, translate like a political discourse on the interaction between regime elements and jihadist elements in terms of cross-border smuggling, because it wouldn't be effective at doing that. But in terms of doing simple things like who's responsible, what time something happened, and what happened, actually Google Translate can be quite useful. Despite that, I'm still learning Arabic. I've been learning it for about a year. I'm going to Jordan, I hope, in a few months to try and improve my language skills. But for basic stuff, Google Translate's pretty good. But yeah, if you have the ability to speak that language, it's much, much better.
Cool. I hope you had a good time there. Yeah, thanks.
No worries.
I have a question. Sorry, one more question.
Go for it.
About the last investigation you showed, relating to like new information coming out over time. So the map previously didn't have the blood spots on it, and then eventually you found that there was new information. How do you work with that, and do you like periodically? And when do you decide that you should stop looking, and when do you think you should go back for new info?
Yeah, so that's actually a really good question. So in terms of like satellite imagery, there are only a limited number of satellites which create this imagery and a limited number of places where you can get it. And it's such a central part of what we do that we're constantly checking satellite imagery, especially if it's related to an investigation or an ongoing investigation. Yeah, in terms of knowing when to stop, sometimes we don't. So there are lots and lots of investigations we've never published because we've never got the information necessary to do so. Eventually that information may come out and we may publish that investigation, but currently there isn't. Some of the geolocations that we've published, some of the investigations that we published, took like 2-3 years to carry out, simply because it was not possible with the information we had to publish it when we wanted to. But generally you'll find with these kind of instances that most of the information will be there that you need before. It's very rare that a satellite imagery will take 3 or 4 months to come out, and we'll have to rely on that satellite imagery. Usually, we'll have the kind of information required before we publish. Yeah. Sorry, does that answer the question?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay. Cool.
Hi, Nick. I got one more question really quickly.
Yeah, go for it.
I've got a question about the people who are posting the videos, and is there ever any increased danger after posting and when you pick up the investigation, and do you get involved in witness protection as well?
Yeah. So yeah, when you post this kind of these kind of social media posts, although they are posted publicly by these users, you have to bear in mind that they may not have envisaged those posts going beyond their immediate network. So them posting, a tweet or a Facebook post is not equivalent to us in taking that post and then publishing it on, say, the New York Times, because that amount of exposure is exponentially larger than anything they expected. So therefore, it generates a duty of care between someone who takes that and uses that social media post and the person who has published that, even if you have no idea who they may actually be. So, for example, in Sudan, there are lots of videos and images of protests and security forces cracking down those protests. but a lot of them are filmed from homes, which leaves you in a bit of quandary. Like, do you geolocate that image to verify and show the verification of what has happened? Because being open about a geolocation is regarded as being central to establishing trust in the investigation. But at the same time, that will potentially identify the house or the location where that person took that video. So you may therefore put that person under threat. So whenever you carry out these investigations, there's no hard and fast rule. You have to bear that in mind every time you conduct one of these geolocations, verifications, or use a piece of media, and think about whether it could potentially result in harm to the person who filmed it. Cool.
Thanks.
No worries. Okay, if there aren't, I'm going to scoot on to the next topic, which is leaks, databases, and digital shadows. The thing about today's world is that everywhere is digitized. We interact with digital systems constantly, whether it's logging into our email, logging into services, using services, takeaway services, whatever. There's a huge amount of information about us that's digitized. I know people who've tried to limit that kind of digital footprint by using like maybe an iPod instead of an iPhone or an Android phone, who don't have social media, who try to remain in the shadow as much as possible. But the reality is, in today's world, it's not possible, really, or for the vast majority of people, it's not possible to interact with society and not interact with digital systems in some way. So everybody has a digital shadow, a digital footprint, which potentially shows, where they've been, where they live, who they interact with. Possibly stupid stuff they've done too. Now, for most people, this may represent like some really dumb thing they did on Facebook, and a picture on Facebook that shows the really dumb thing they did. And for most people, this would be kind of, maybe a bit embarrassing. For most people, this would be kind of embarrassing. But at the same time, for other people, it may be a little bit more significant. Say, if you are a member of a state intelligence service. So these two, Mr. Petrov and Mr. Bosharov, are the cover identities of the two men who tried to poison the Skripals back in, it was 2018 now, a long time ago. And we initially didn't think we could do much with this case because they're, we don't know who these guys are. There doesn't seem to be much online about them. But then RT published this interview.
What were you doing there?
Our friends had been suggesting for a long time that we visit this wonderful town.
Salisbury? A wonderful town?
Yes.
There's the famous Salisbury Cathedral, famous not only in Europe, but in the whole world. It's famous for its 123-meter spire. It's famous for its clock, the one of the first ever created in the world that's still working.
You can clearly see those are definitely two sports fitness like protein supplement salesmen who simply went to Salisbury to look at the cathedral for a couple of days. But once we watched that video, we decided that we couldn't let this slide, and we decided to try and use both digital shadows as well as more traditional source of information like traditional journalistic techniques in order to work out who these two guys were. So what I'm going to show you is a very abridged version of how we identified Mr. Petrov, whose real name is Dr. Alexander Mishkin, hero of Russia. So, as I said, we mixed open source information, primarily comprised of leaked databases, with traditional or information we got from traditional journalistic sources. So we obtained these guys' international passport dossiers through a traditional journalistic source in Russia. So we have quite strong connections with Russian journalistic outfits, and so we're able to generate this kind of information. And even with the international passport dossiers of their cover identities, there wasn't much information we could use there to leverage. However, it did have, their names, their birth dates, passport numbers, as well as location where the passport were issued. And one of them for Mr. Mishkin was St. Petersburg. And we thought, maybe what if we looked at all the leaked databases associated with St. Petersburg for people who had maybe the same first name, same patronym, maybe same last name, and maybe same birth date as Mr. Mishkin. Maybe we'll find someone with the same details. Because when you create a cover identity, if you change every single detail of a person's identity, it actually makes it quite difficult to remember. And so you might change a few things. You might change their first name or their last name. Maybe the birth date is the same, maybe not. You might keep it the same. It's quite a difficult thing to remember usually if you're under stress, for example. So we started looking through these databases, and we identified someone who had the same first name, same patronym, and the same birth date as this guy Mishkin, although his name was his last name was different. This is really interesting to us. This guy had a lot of details which seemed to match. So we decided to try and look in other databases for this guy, and we found a leaked car insurance database which had this guy's Volvo. His cover identity is Petrov. His real identity is Mishkin, and it had Mishkin's Volvo. And what's really interesting was where Mishkin had registered his Volvo, and his car was registered to this address. Now, if you're a member of a state intelligence agency and you want to avoid fines, you want to avoid the police tailing you, you want to avoid speeding fines, parking fines, that kind of stuff. If you register your car to maybe your place of work, the police won't bother you because they run the check on that address and it comes back with an obvious location. And in this case, that location was the headquarters of the GRU. So this guy had registered his car to the GRU and was like, hey, yeah, these guys won't touch me. So obviously Mr. Mishkin immediately became, this guy is clearly associated with the GRU. But we still need to match Mr. Mishkin to Mr. Petrov. And eventually, again, through traditional journalistic means, we obtained a copy of Mr. Mishkin's passport, which included his picture. And then we carried out a facial comparison. We actually asked Birmingham University to carry out a facial comparison between Petrov and Mishkin. It came back with a 90% match, which is enough to unlock your iPhone or your laptop through facial recognition. And at that point, we're happy saying these two are the same people. Mr. Mishkin is Mr. Petrov. And what's fascinating about this case is actually how, once you had the formula, how easy it was to identify these intelligence agents. For example, okay, one guy, Mishkin, had registered his car to the GRU address. How many other people had done that? Over 350. 350 people have registered their vehicles to this GRU address. And how many of these people are just, do you think are just random people who registered their car to that address? Probably not many. There are probably a lot of administrative workers, that kind of stuff, but there are going to be a lot of genuine GRU secret agents within that database. Obviously, we've blurred out their names because we can't say that they have done anything, or we can't certain say they have done anything or who they are. But finding this kind of information is not actually as difficult as you'd think. For example, you can find these kind of websites, especially associated with Russia, selling these kind of databases. And the reason for this is the huge criminal cyber economy in Russia, as well as just low-level corruption. So if you're a civil servant who pay is pretty low, you want to supplement your pay somehow, you have access to potentially a lot of information, and so you can sell that information to cyber criminals for a little bit of extra cash. And this forms the bedrock of the kind of identity theft, stealing credit card details, fraud that forms a lot of the criminal digital economy at the moment. And it's not too difficult to find. This is just a surface website, so not even on the dark web. So if you want to identify stuff, you have to know what to look for. So does anyone know what the British military slang is to tell stories? There's no reason anyone should know because it's really unique. It is to spin dits. Now, when you look for to spin dits on Google, you will find results associated with the British military, because that phrase is only used by the British military. Now, if you know the phrases that criminals use to find information, then you can search for it on Google and then find it within half a second. So this is an example of what's called fulls, which is a full set of a person's information. And what you can see here is just from Pastebin, it's open internet. It's probably an example used to sell other databases. You know, they'll say, hey, look at this merch, like this is an example, all the rest of it is as good as this example, buy my database. And what we've got is, you know, full name, the username, mobile number, email address, social security number, credit card number, the CVV, which expires in November of this year, so it's still extant when it was leaked. Hence why I've blacked all this out so you can't start committing fraud. The IP address, security answer, the job, the passport details, the details of their family. This kind of information gets posted online constantly. When I was working in cyber threat intelligence, I worked for a cyber threat intelligence company called Digital Shadows, and then a bank, Lloyds Bank. And this is the kind of information that we saw being stolen and then posted online about our customers constantly. There's so much information out there. And it's not just criminals who enable this as well. Often you'll find companies whose privacy policies aren't that good, who will leak information in a way they don't necessarily expect to. So has anyone heard about the Strava stuff? Yeah, a few nods. So Strava is a fitness app, and what it does, it allows you to track your runs and compare them against other people's runs as well, which we'll get back to in a bit. But in, I think, as 2017, again, dates escape me, they started posting this information online as a theoretically anonymized map, heat map, showing where people were using the app. And it was very beautiful, you know, GIS, wow, that kind of stuff. And you can see that primarily this app was being used in Europe. You can't really see it, but in the US and also in East Asia, so in South Korea, Japan, and so on. But there are also places which are kind of surprising where it's being used. So it's being used a little bit in Somalia, a little bit in Afghanistan, a little bit in Syria. Now, who do you think are going to be the kind of people who are in Somalia, Afghanistan, and Syria who are interested in keeping up their fitness and are using an app that is primarily used by people in the West or in East Asia? Have a guess.
Expats or soldiers, or yeah.
Yeah. So you're unlikely to find that many expats in the middle of Idlib in Syria, but you are likely to find soldiers. And it's interesting you mentioned the expat thing as well. This will also collect, you know, someone from, say, maybe the UN, for example, as well. So you can't be absolutely certain about the stuff. But what it does do is it indicates a place where you could start searching. Oh, sorry, the sun's getting in my eyes. So we started looking at different places where you could see little hotspots of light. So this is Helmand province in Afghanistan, and you can see Camp Bastion, where I spent quite a lot of time. Very, very boring and hot and dull, but everyone knows that base is there. What's interesting is if you look further south, you know, what's this area down here? And down here, right in the hook of the river around Garmsir, what's that tiny little base down there? That's really interesting. At the time this was taken, there shouldn't have been any forces down there. It's really, really interesting. If you go to the Somali and Kenyan border, you see similar results. You know, what's these little dots of light up here and here and there and there? Wonder who's there. Now, as I mentioned before, you know, potentially you can pick up, say, people who work maybe for the UN or other NGOs, agencies. But what this represents is a place where you can start looking, which was, yeah, very useful. But there's another aspect of Strava that produced a weakness. And that was the ability to compare yourself against other people who'd run the same routes as you had. So is anyone familiar with this location? Does anyone know where this is? So this is Stirling Lines in Hereford. So this is where 22 SAS is based, and also the majority of the UK's other special forces assets. And you know, they're special forces, they want to keep fit, they use Strava. Now, from this information, really what you could only tell from the map is that, you know, these people would use Strava. Okay, that's fine, that's not that surprising. But what I could do is I worked out how to fool, or somebody else worked out how to fool the Strava, or you could work out how to fool the Strava app into thinking that you would run a certain section of track, a certain, what they called a segment. And then Strava would show you who else had run that segment as well. So what I did is I created a segment called the Hereford Shuffle, which is about 400 meters. And also I later learned, entirely from coincidence, I placed it outside what is a gym in Stirling Lines. Uploaded this run to Strava, and it's really simple. It's just like a few different waypoints. Like in this case, I think 3 or 4 waypoints and a time period. So how long it took to run. And then as soon as I uploaded it, Strava thought that I had run that route. And it started showing me other people who'd run that route as well. And then I let it on for about 5 minutes, and it showed me 14 people who'd run that route. And what was really interesting with this was that some of these profiles, you could actually click through to their Facebook profiles because they'd linked their Strava app to their Facebook app. So I could instantly find out who these people were. Even though I had their name, I could click through to their social media footprint immediately. And then from there, I can just like compare the Facebook friends, which you can do with a little bit of Facebook URL between, you know, maybe number 1 and number 4. And I can start to build up the organizational map of what what Special Forces organization looks like. Which is really interesting. Yeah, so that's how like you can even take kind of information that's been leaked from low-level corruption, but also through other companies and people who just, you know, trying to do their job better by, you know, becoming fitter. I think that's about an hour, or I've been talking for about an hour now. I've got a little bit more in terms of crowdsourcing, and then we'll get on to like search engine operators. Yeah, so I'm going to go through crowdsourcing and take a break for a couple of minutes, and then we'll come back if that's okay.
That's perfect.
Cool. Okay. So finding this information often isn't just like one person doing it. We'll often ask people to help crowdsource. And probably the most successful example of that is Europol's Trace and Object campaign. So what Europol started doing was posting very heavily censored images from child abuse cases, asking people to identify an object. So, you know, maybe a T-shirt or a bag or something, and locations as well, asking people, you know, did they recognize that location? And, you know, these were cases where they couldn't progress any further, so they asked people to help. And the response was incredible. You had, you know, people interacting on Twitter, on Facebook, on Reddit. There's a very active subreddit looking at this kind of stuff. And it turned out to be, well, the power of the crowd was actually pretty incredible in this case. So you had people identifying, you know, like shoes, like shopping bags, items of clothing, just from these kind of grainy, very heavily censored images that Europol were posting. And then Europol was taking that information, then combining it with their investigations. And like the locations were, as I showed you before with the geolocation aspect, people were getting these locations down to precisely where events had taken place. So for example, in this case, clearly the subjects are blurred out, but someone managed to identify the exact hotel room in which this photo was taken. You know, the exact hotel room. You know, you can look at the beads on the left and the right and match them up as well. And the result of using this kind of crowdsourcing, Europol got something like 24,000 tips, 9 children rescued, and that's actually now at 3 prosecutions rather than 2. But it shows you how actually you can leverage the crowd to gather this information for you as well. Yeah, I think in terms of limitations of open source, before I take this break, there are limitations which you need to be aware of if you're going to apply this kind of techniques. firstly, you need to be aware of data availability and tunnel vision, especially with relation to taboo subjects. Not every single event is going to be captured on film. Crimes or events that happen in private are much less likely to be captured. Incidents like torture, sexual violence are not likely to be represented in the open source body of information. There's still probably contextual information there, but the actual crimes themselves are unlikely to be captured. And that's something you need to bear in mind when this kind of stuff happens, because you're also reaching the point where people regard, if it wasn't filmed, it didn't take place, which isn't true. So you do need to be aware of that kind of mindset, and that kind of, or your own biases as well. It's not so great at establishing intent. Open source information is very good for establishing what happened, but who carried it out and why is a little bit more difficult. And that's much more likely to be represented accurately in documents. So, for example, there's an organization called CIJA, which has been collecting documents from Syria, and that's much more likely to tell you the why of why events have been carried out and the intent. Preservation of sources is really difficult. This is a really interesting subject. Basically, you have large bodies like YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, who've deleted content at a vast scale. Some of these pieces of content showed crimes, very clearly showed war crimes. And because the person who posted that video is now dead, that video is gone forever. So they have deleted evidence of war crimes, and it's gone. This is an ongoing issue, and it's also unbalanced as well. In the English, or you'll see social media companies taking action against English-speaking accounts in a very different way than, say, Arabic-speaking accounts or other languages. They are far, far more likely to take down an activist page posting and tweeting in Arabic than they are in English, presumably because of the kind of algorithms they put together in order to scrub Islamic State and Al-Qaeda content from their platforms. That also captures a huge number of activists who are posting about, horrific incidents have taken place. But the social media companies decided that that kind of collateral damage is acceptable to what they're doing, the primary aim, which is to remove ISIS or Al-Qaeda propaganda from the internet. And you see stuff being treated in a much different way in different languages by social media companies. There's some organizations like Syrian Archive, Yemeni Archive, who are trying to correct this, but you still have to regard everything posted on social media as ephemeral. Eventually it will disappear. There's also a novelty value of it. Although the novelty value encourages people to interact with this kind of information, it also means that in trying to apply it in courts is a process we're still going through at the moment. Although open source information has been used in courts, its use is still not fully understood and still relies a lot upon the judge in terms of its admissibility as evidence. And then finally, we have the ethical considerations, which I've already spoken about a little bit, spoken a little bit about. Yeah. So before we get on to the more practical aspects for the next kind of 40 minutes or so, or 30 minutes or so, are there any questions about anything that I've covered over the last hour and 5 minutes, which is slightly longer than I wanted to go on? Just shout out, please.
I just had this one quick question. I noticed on the Bellingcat website that the two language options you have is English and Russian, I think. I was curious why. Because I think Russia is just, it's very notorious for having media that is unreliable. So I'm curious just to quickly hear why you guys decided to report in Russian too.
So we also have an Arabic page as well, although Arabic, it may not be that. Yeah, it's not that well advertised, and it's only like a few articles we end up translating on there because we don't have a grant for translating Arabic. Basically, in 2014, a lot of the primary interest for Bellingcat when it was founded was the invasion of Ukraine. So a lot of the articles that we've posted relate to Russia and Ukraine, especially in kind of 2014, 2015. And quite a few of our members, especially like the early volunteers, are Russian, or Russian speaking. A lot of Ukrainians are Russian speaking as well. So it made sense to post in that language, to try and say, hey, actually, here's an alternate source of news. Our methodology is clear. These are sources that we've used. Read our investigation. So it's primarily due to the initial instance that we were gathering or looking at in 2014.
Cool. I think that's wonderful. A really quick follow up. Do you get a lot of traffic from Russian speaking countries? Okay, cool.
Not as much. Primarily, our biggest audience at the moment is the US. I think like Russia, Ukraine generally tends to be in kind of the top 5 countries who are visiting the site, but I haven't looked at the stats recently, so I wouldn't be able to tell you any specific numbers, I'm afraid.
Cool, thank you.
No worries.
I had a quick question just about some of the, so a lot of the, going back to what you were talking about, searching for fulls and spinning bits, and without so I know that there are kind of online communities that start to develop their own languages and their own references to things. Without embedding yourself in each of these communities, how do you manage to essentially gather these code words or
Well, actually, we do cover that in the coming presentation, but I'll give you a quick heads up. That first keyword is probably the most difficult. Working out what keywords to use is the most difficult. Usually it's a case of asking around, because someone will know something about that community. But once you have one keyword, you can then proliferate. You can find one website, one forum, one social media account, and then look at other kind of words that they use. So for example, like with either white nationalists or like people who want to start a civil war in the US, you look for Boogaloo, which is their word for the civil war, and then you'll start to find other words being used. Like if you hear people talking about PEDs, then probably talking about Trump supporters on 4chan, 8chan. If you hear people talking about Goyim, it means they're almost certainly talking in an anti-Semitic capacity. And once you have kind of one keyword, you can kind of break into the network and find other keywords which might indicate who people are. So once you have that one keyword, it becomes a lot easier to find more. Cool.
I had a question about how do you, especially in relation to these methods starting out in communities that were very spread out and by individual people and organic, but also associated with conspiracy theories, and a lot of these platforms took a left turn into some crazy stuff. And how does that kind of stigma still carry or prevent? Is it part of what prevents these investigations from being taken seriously for prosecutions? And I think you get my question. Yeah,
it's a good question. So there are two aspects of this. One is a kind of organic kind of where we've come from aspect. And I think we've managed to get past that. I think probably the turning point in some circles, probably around 2016, 2017, but in kind of popular culture, it really was 2018 with the Skripal work. And then more recently in 18 and 19, we've been working with lawyers in order to work out how we can use our information or gather and present that information in a way that can be used as evidence in court. And so, we've been working with lawyers, and for example, yesterday I had a presentation with university in Amsterdam, and they had someone from the ICC, the International Criminal Court, on the call. So we have people who are members of accountability bodies like the ICC who know who we are. So I think we as bellingcat, and also the general methods, are the knowledge is becoming beginning to infiltrate into accountability bodies and into courts. So we are moving away from that. There's still a inauthentic kind of campaign out there to paint bellingcat as the worst thing in the world. which probably won't take too long to find if you want to. But it's interesting from my perspective as someone who's working with lawyers, trying to put into place ways that we can use this information as evidence in court, trying to hold states and the powerful to account, versus sometimes what I read online, which is, to be frank, almost entirely not true. So there's still that kind of stigma there. A lot of it generated, although some organic, quite a lot of it is state generated. But the point at which we are means that matters less and less as we go on, because our methods are already being shown to be effective and are being used by accountability bodies.
Small follow-up. Do you ever feel unsafe because of that?
Sometimes, yes. So our members have faced intimidation, some of it due to cybersecurity, some of it physical security. One of our volunteers, Russian volunteer, who is so incredibly brave, like it's very difficult to describe the stuff that he's done. Like he once went to a Russian military museum. We needed to find the diameter of a Russian chemical weapon. So he went to a Russian military museum, like in a military base, with a piece of string, and then stepped over into the exhibit itself to measure the munition diameter and size, and did that for every one of the munitions and marked it off on a piece of string. Like he is so like kind of crazy brave. But his phone got compromised, because if you're in Russia, you know, the Russian telecom companies are owned by, or can be influenced by a state quite easily. And so like all of his personal information is out there. Like just this morning, I got a security alert that someone's trying to break into one of my email accounts. And like we face that kind of cyber threat pretty much constantly since 2014, 2015. If you're familiar with Fancy Bear, which is associated with the GRU, they have been constant campaigns to try and hack into our email accounts. But yeah, as I said, there's also been like physical intimidation from just fanatics who believe we're like the epitome of evil as well. So yes, sometimes I do, but I just limit what kind of information I post online and try and keep a generally lower profile than as is possible. Yeah. Cool. If there are no more questions, I think, shall we take like a 3-minute break so we can get away, grab some water, that kind of stuff, and then we'll spend the next kind of half hour doing some stuff that's hopefully a bit more practical, and that hopefully you guys will benefit from as well. Cool.
That
okay,
sounds fantastic.
Awesome. Yeah. Okay. All right, start again at like, say 16 minutes past, 3 minutes.
Fabulous.